Hello, everyone. Just waiting for our feed loop to be securely started, and it has. Once again, I'm Keith, and I'm here for our last session. And we have two wonderful guests with us who are going to take us into wrap-up time. And I'm pleased to introduce both Sarah and Stefaan. And what we're going to do is have a quick introduction by each of them, just to talk a little bit about their backgrounds and make a few ponder points for us as we get started in our discussion. So I'll turn things over to Sarah first, and Sarah is Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Management, University of Waterloo, Canada Research Chair, Sustainability and Innovation. So Sarah, if you'd like to tell us a bit more about yourself, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thank you for having me. This is, I think this will be a really fruitful and interesting conversation and exchange. So I can just give you a little bit of my background and then offer a couple of thoughts before we sort of pass it back and forth. So as Keith mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo. I'm also executive director of our interdisciplinary center on climate change. So I lead a very large collaboration of scientists and social scientists, over 100 folks from all different disciplines across the university who examine climate change, whether they be engineers or biologists or philosophers or all sorts of excellent scientists. And it's relevant to what I'd like to sort of put on the table today as some emerging and really important efforts in the climate change space globally, on down to the local. Is a role that I've played for many years now. I'm one of the lead authors of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the IPCC, I'm gonna like take the privilege of about 45 seconds of telling you what the IPCC is, because I think it's really important. And this isn't in a self-aggrandizing way, but the IPCC is a body convened by the United Nations that gathers together scientists from all around the globe, nominated by their home governments. So member nations of the UN nominate scientists to come together periodically and try to assess the state of global social science and science on climate change. What do we know? There's just such a profusion of work in this space, and we need the best possible science to be able to make decisions around climate change, from global treaties like the Paris Agreement and Kyoto before that, on down to municipal action plans, business sustainability plans, the whole gamut. So these scientists are doing this work voluntarily. And we just released our latest report on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the science of climate change mitigation, on April 4th, which was 3 or 4 years in the making. We reviewed 18,000 scientific journal articles. We responded to over 60,000 peer review comments line by line, and addressed all of those comments, all to get to this place where we could say, this is what we can, coherently, confidently say about climate. And that then is fed into policy. And I just wanted to put out there a couple of the key findings that I think are really important when we're discussing how to make change on sustainability issues, and whether or not and how change is unfolding in the climate space. And there's 2 findings from this latest assessment that I think are really important. One is that greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. So globally over the last 10 years, greenhouse gas emissions are the highest they've ever been in human history. So that's not great news, considering how much time we're spending talking about and working on climate change. It means that target we've set for ourselves of keeping warming to less than 2 degrees, or hopefully 1.5 degrees of warming, is out of reach unless something really big happens really fast. But the other really important message out of this effort, which is like nothing else, really, it's the largest scientific collaboration of its kind. One of the main findings is that we're finally seeing evidence, on the flip side, of real sustained greenhouse gas reductions on the part of about 24 countries. More than that, about 20 countries have sustained greenhouse gas reductions over the last 10 years in such a way that we know it's not a blip. It's not like 2008, 2009 financial crisis related or COVID related. It's really the result of effective changes, of effective policies. And there's so many different tools and solutions that are coming into play, and really kind of at at the exponential increase point of the curve that are so exciting, and maybe we'll get into those in a minute. But just a couple of the trends, for instance, the cost of solar photovoltaics by unit have just plummeted, like more faster than anyone could have anticipated 15 years ago or 20 years ago, down 85%. The cost of wind down by 55%, this kind of thing. So there's an incredible escalation of technological innovation, but there's also really important themes emerging around justice and equity in responding to climate change, the role that cities can play as sort of the geographic space in which so much collides, the impacts of climate change on the one hand, the floods, the heat waves, the droughts, as well as the solutions, those low carbon buildings and electrified transport and renaturing cities and all of this. So I wanted to sort of lay the groundwork there because, it's Earth Day. We're having all of these conversations all week about how to think about our relationship with nature. I get a lot of questions about, should we be hopeful? Is there a reason to hope, or is it all lost? There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of anger when it comes to climate change. But this report that we just launched through the United Nations a couple of weeks ago shows a really complex picture. And the work that all of you in this community are doing is a really integral part of creating open, collaborative dialogue around how far we've come and where we have to go. So I'll come back around to that maybe as we progress, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, fantastic. I think you've given me some stuff to think about already. I'm jotting some things down. We'll move to Stefaan, and then we'll come back for some more discussion with each of us. Stefaan, actually, sorry, let me give you your brief introduction as well. I just want to make sure I have it right. Yeah, you're co-founder and Chief Research and Development Officer with the Governance Lab, or the GovLab, as we call it. And we've already seen evidence of your work through some of your activities participating with us at Good. So we appreciate you also participating in this discussion as well. So what are you all about, sir?
Great. Well, thanks, Keith, and pleasure to be here on this panel. And it's kind of hard to follow someone who is doing such an important work with regard to documenting and pointing to evidence as it relates to climate crisis, the climate crisis, and more importantly, also on whether anything we do makes a difference. But as you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of GovLab, or Governance Laboratory. And so we are an action research center based here in New York. We are part of the Engineering School of New York University. And our mission is to really look into how do we transform the way we make decisions as it relates to global societal challenges, such as climate change, but also, of course, what we've been focused on the last 2.5 years, such as the pandemic, but also, anyway, any other kind of challenge that resides in society, but also, anyway, thinking about how do we then subsequently design solutions that are fit for purpose as well. And typically we approach our work by considering that we can actually transform the way we go about decision making, because we have two important assets that we can leverage in new ways. And I think what was already mentioned here is already an indication on how that has happened. One, we can leverage people and their expertise in new ways that we never had before by actually connecting and collaborating in new ways to extract the supply of expertise and connect that to the demand side. And so that's one big area of our work is focused on collective intelligence. And I think what was presented earlier really is an effort of how do we bring all the collective intelligence to the table to actually provide a baseline on where we are, upon which we then can build a foundation moving forward. But then obviously, in addition to people and their expertise, the other big asset that we have in the current day and age is obviously, which is why I'm here, data. And so here we've done a lot of work on how do we then start using data in order to inform decision making. But obviously, the key realization here is that in order to use data, one actually needs to have access to data. And that is one of our biggest challenges, in the current era where there is, on the one hand, data abundance, but on the other hand, data scarcity, because we don't have, as a society, figured out how to unlock the data abundance that might be created as a result of the digital transformation that is currently happening. And so that has been a key focus of our area, is really about how do we deal with those data asymmetries, i.e. those that have data and those that need data but don't have access to the data, but anyway, if provided access, could enable better decision making and better ways to actually deal with our problems that we have today. Now, we are kind of working across a variety of areas, but we have also done, anyway, of course, quite some work in the area of environmental data. Both, anyway, we have an initiative around ocean data, for instance, at the moment, which is very interesting because, of course, quite often the whole concept of ocean data, especially here in the US, gets approached through the lens of the blue economy, which I think is an interesting kind of approach, because obviously, clearly, there is massive economic gain if we are becoming smarter about managing the ocean, such as precision fishing, for instance, but at the same time, there is massive sustainability and environmental challenges if we don't, of course, steer the blue economy in a more sustainable manner as well. And that's the tension that we are seeking to address, is by actually building those data collaboratives to both sustain a certain kind of blue economy that is actually environmental, sustainable, and contributes to a better practice of managing a public resource, or anyway, like the ocean, which of course, anyway, has its own challenges because it is a public resource, right? Now, we do other work in the space of environmental data. One initiative that we have at the moment as well is with the G7 and the G20, where we are looking into what would a governance framework look like for collaboration around environmental related data. And as part of that, we have identified a whole range of tensions that we need to solve in order to actually unlock trusted access to environmental related data. And those tensions, anyway, I'm not going to go through all 10 tensions that we have identified, but they are based upon the fact that we are talking about a really vast diversity of sources, vast diversity of actors that need to be brought together in order to actually generate insight that matters. And the diversity and the variety of the sources in itself is already a challenge, because there are multiple agendas, interests, and concerns attached to those different types of data that we need to find a common way of accessing it. And the reason why we don't have that common way is because we don't actually have common principles at the moment for environmental related data, that absent those kinds of principles, there will always be kind of a customized discussion about under what conditions do we need to have access and for what purposes do we need to have access. Other area, and again, I've identified 10 tensions that we need to solve one way, but another area is actually very interesting tension between, on the one hand, the environmental justice community and the data justice community. Because the environmental justice community, on the one hand, clearly wants to have more data to really use data from an advocacy point of view, and also from a point of view to illustrate inequities in how, for instance, the burden of climate change is distributed. But then the data justice community quite often, of course, advocates for less use of data and for actually increased constraints on how data is being used. And from my point of view, within the justice community, this tension between the environmental justice and the data justice community is something that we're going to have to figure out in a way that is based upon collaboration, deliberation, and more importantly, finding a way to actually develop a governance structure that that is meaningful. So that's, I guess, enough for an introduction, except for saying that the last thing I want to say about the environmental related data, is that we also have to do a lot more work, and that's another area that we have worked on, to establish a social license for actually using certain kinds of data. And that's another tension point that I think quite often is put aside as, anyway, yeah, we will deal with that later. But I think unless we get that social license for actually using certain kinds of environmental data, for instance, data that is associated or is linked to indigenous groups or tribes, for instance, as it relates to ocean data, for instance, it's going to be very hard to actually build that kind of foundation that was mentioned earlier, upon which we can build to actually make data-driven decisions as it relates to the Earth and as it relates to climate as well. So with that, so just a few reflections, Keith. I don't know whether that's what you had in mind, but just to get us going here.
And it certainly does. Again, from both of you, I've written things down. And it's a lot to unpack. So obviously, we're not going to resolve it in our time allotted today, but I think much of what you said really is important. I like your idea of tensions to be solved. I mean, tension is such a good word, isn't it, right? I feel like that's what we're experiencing, the tension between, again, let's say in Canada with the pipeline debate, right? Especially now with Russian oil. And, you know, if you stop using Russian oil, can we swoop in? And we can't build a pipeline that fast. Should we build the pipeline? Tensions, absolutely. And I was thinking, Sarah, when you talked about the UN work, and I think I may have mentioned this to you, Stefan, before in another conversation on a webinar or whatever, but the idea of herding cats to get this done. We've done a lot of work on standards with people, and a lot of people are saying, oh, yeah, got to have standards, but they also add kind of in small print, right? As long as they're the ones I'm using. So I'm going to ask Sarah to, especially about the UN, like how difficult was it to get to this point that you really got something that sounds very, very concrete and very, very positive. So was it a really long road, or was it easier than you think because of like-minded people?
No, it's enormously difficult.
Yeah. Now tell us a bit about that.
It's enormously difficult. So yes. So, I mean, keeping in mind that the IPCC was formed so that there was an evidence base, a scientific evidence base upon which governance decisions could be made. So that's exactly its function, is that when countries come together from a political standpoint and negotiate how much, you know, what their targets are for their greenhouse gas reductions and whether they sign on to the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto Protocol, they can all be looking at the same science. And so that requires a couple of things. It requires geographic representation, so scientists from all of those member nations, especially from the global south. It requires gender and other diversity among the scientists themselves, disciplinary diversity. So, you know, on my chapter, for instance, so each, you know, there's about 250 authors of my report alone. So there's close to 1,000 authors of the report as a whole. And our third of the report was 3,000 pages that is distilled down to about 60 for policymakers. So it gets streamlined and synthesized and drilled down into something that is supposed to be useful. But in the early stages, it's a matter of 15 people on each chapter coming together from different countries, different disciplines, and often speaking different languages, but using the UN language, there are many UN languages, but our operating language in science is English, which creates a lot of barriers for many folks to participate actively in the scientific process. And then bring all of this different disciplinary language that we use. If you're an economist, you make different assumptions and think a different way, perhaps, than a evolutionary biologist might, or, you know, a philosopher or a geographer or political scientist or whatever. So trying to come to a common agreement of what the scholarship around the world is telling us about the climate, what is being done, what's working, what's not working, means a lot of really tough choices about what's in and what's out, and how much evidence there has to be supporting a claim before it remains in. So what I think is beautiful about it, it's super messy. It takes years. It's blood, sweat, and tears, you know, by a lot of people with the end goal in mind of providing this foundation upon which we can make decisions. What I think is beautiful is that it's science colliding with policy. You know, you can't keep science over here in this little objective, pure objective truth kind of pot, and over here is the messy politics of the issue. This is very much at the interface where we translate all of this data, socioeconomic data, biophysical data about the planet, and then consider the political repercussions and the power of each word. And so it's remarkable in that way at the interface between science and policy, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds incredible, actually, but obviously achievable. And yeah, I'm thinking, not to be facetious, but like a country and western song these days has a huge amount of authors, right? All contributing whatever, a little lick
Yeah.
here, a sound there. And what also is interesting, I think you're right about their expertise and so on, which I remember, in school, people talked about, contributions made by lots of people, and that it's a good thing. And I'm just not sure if that's
Yeah.
stuck with many of people who have gone through schooling or whatever. But yeah, very, very interesting. And Stefaan, regards to the have and have-nots and social licenses, I'm reminded of, let's say, social contracts. Maybe we need a climate contract. There is a specific question for you, so you can stew that in your head. But this comes from Ushnish. Can you expand on the tension between environmental justice and data justice? Yes, increased data collection often results in increasing inequities. Are there examples where environmental open data initiatives have resulted in greater equity outcomes? Do you want me to read that again, or?
Yeah, meaning there's a whole range of examples that showcase that actually open data has supported the environmental justice movement, right? Because suddenly they had actually a mechanism to document and provide evidence of the inequity that had happened. One example, and I can point to a case study that we've done with regard to that example, was here in the US. And it's Friday afternoon, so the name escapes me right now. But it was a community in the US where for years they had argued that water supply was segregated, i.e. those that lived in the in the well-off, quite often white communities had access to water, and those that were less well-off and clearly were of different ethnicity did not have access to data. And for years, that was an argument that they tried to win, unless actually until the city released open data, where they could clearly point to actually the lines on where water supply stopped and where it started. And I think those are examples where data is a really powerful tool for showing power asymmetries, but also asymmetries with regard to, for instance, distribution of services that are important. Same thing with regard to, for instance, air quality and where you put, for instance, a highway and document that the highway will run through economically more deprived areas, where then the air quality will become worse. I think being able to point in a data-driven manner those kinds of injustices is really what makes it a stronger argument, and also what has proven to be valuable to win in court, for instance, if you start litigating those kinds of environmental injustices. Now, at the same time, you have to be careful, because it can also be abused, the whole concept of open data, especially open science data. And I always point to what happened here in the US under the previous administration, where at a certain point in time, the Trump administration advocated for, we will only base our environmental decisions based upon science, where the data for which the insight was generated was made open. And suddenly, of course, you had all those insights that were generated in closed journals, where the data quite often was not shared to document the insight, right, and how the insight was generated. Suddenly, this whole scientific body of knowledge was discredited for political purposes using open data as an excuse. And so you have to be careful in, anyway, how far you push the open data angle, because clearly, anyway, a lot of scientific insight is still not, right, combined with actually sharing the data, which of course creates a whole concern from reproducibility, a whole concern, anyway, with regard to open science. But that does not mean that the data or the insight has no value, right? And I think that's where we're going to have to be very sensitive. Those that advocate for open data, that actually it can be abused for political gains as well.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually. And Sarah, you were mentioning the science groups and so on. And I wonder, now a lot of people are saying, you know, we can't establish what is truth, right? Even whether the sun came up this morning, someone may dispute that, and their truth may be very different. I think it complicates the matter because there is such, let's say, a persuasive truth that seems pretty obvious and so on that most people would believe in. But when you get the dissonance or the tensions again, yeah, it can be really difficult. One thing I also wanted to comment too is you talked about you know, the ocean a lot, and the first time I heard the term "don't boil the ocean," don't try to boil the ocean, was from the CIO in Toronto when I was working there, City of Toronto, and it occurred to me though, yeah, but we seemingly can pollute it quite easily. So you know, I'm not sure why we always try to boil it rather than preserve it. One thing that has come up here, a question from Jonathan Brown for Sarah. And just before I ask the question, Jonathan is hosting our hackathon tomorrow. So if anyone watching is still interested or hasn't registered, it is free. And you can find out about that on our website, go-opendata.ca. I wanted to get that in because we're going to be buckling up the seatbelts tomorrow for sure. So Jonathan's question actually is, what is the role of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals in arbitrating the tension between science and politics? So that segues quite nicely.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are a really fascinating statement of collective values, essentially, right? Those are value statements. What do we believe is right, essentially? You know, what are we working towards together? And I think it's important to consider that sustainability, you know, economic, social, environmental good, however you think about it, it's a value statement as much as it is a scientific reality, right? So that means it's a moving target. It's something that we need to collectively contest, debate, maybe agree on, maybe disagree on, revise as our values change. Like there isn't one singular outcome, in my mind at least, that represents a sustainable outcome and then you're done and, you know, the problem has been solved and the question is over. So so the Sustainable Development Goals are a really important partnership building mechanism, way to articulate what global society thinks we should aspire to. For instance, zero poverty, healthy communities, good work, gender equality, all of the various facets of sustainable development, and then assigns targets within each of those goals so that we can actually monitor our progress and see if we're moving along the path that we want to, and put pressure where we need to put pressure to move faster if we're not. One of the fascinating linkages, you know, of course, climate change is one of those SDGs, SDG 13. And one of the main findings from this latest climate change report is that we cannot hope to reach the Sustainable Development Goals unless we tackle climate change. It's core across all of those. We can't feed people, we can't achieve healthy and sustainable communities if we have unbridled climate change and unabated impacts. So there, you know, we must do, we must, you know, move faster on climate change in order to achieve the others. But I would just say, one of the things that I find most exciting about working in the climate change space is that it also opens up opportunities to make our lives better in lots of different ways. So when we wean ourselves off of carbon, if we do it in really clever ways, like moving out of our, you know, internal combustion engine vehicles and onto bicycles, you know, bringing nature back into our cities and all of these things, we get multiple co-benefits out of it. So we can have better physical and mental health, we can have better societal cohesion, we can have better biodiversity, cleaner water and air, while we're ratcheting down our greenhouse gas emissions. And those are complex, and we need to work with data from all different sources. So socioeconomic data, understanding how decarbonizing our neighborhoods affects affordability. You know, are we pricing people out of these low carbon neighborhoods? How do we understand whether a constructed wetland is purifying water and protecting our communities in the same way that building a flood protection barrier was supposed to protect that city before we decided to use nature to do it instead? You know, the ability to gather appropriate data, synthesize it in a way that is meaningful, and feed it into effective decision making is such an important element of pursuing those sustainable futures.
Yeah, interesting point. It reminds me actually of a song I wrote years ago called E-Lullaby, and it said people may not understand climate change is more than just the weather. We're in this thing together, which I think is another point, right? Is that if we're working at opposites to each other, or put the burden onto other countries, our circumstances are different in Canada, of course, with vehicle use. I mean, especially in the you're from Winnipeg today, and we were talking about that. But you know, and as you're driving, you know, it's a route that you have to take. You can't necessarily use transit for it. So yeah, it's such a complex bundle of issues, and I think sometimes people want the elevator version of it and not realize the depth and maybe the commitments that we have to make as citizens, and it's not going to be easy. But are we prepared to make any commitments? Are we prepared to change any of our behaviors to get there? And we, in our country, may have to go first, faster, simply because of our economic position and things like that. Like, we can afford to do it in some ways, where other countries, as Stefaan mentions, may not even have clean drinking water. It's a little different on what we're asking them to do. Which leads me to the big question that I wanted to drop on you today, which is from a changemaker's view. You know, the adage of all we have for sure is death, taxes, and change. And I was saying as we were getting started before we went live that maybe we can't do anything about death, but with AI coming around the corner and so on, maybe we can do something about death. Taxes, yeah, we might have some influence that way, depending on where we are in power, et cetera. But then there's change, right? And I wonder your take on this idea of how we can control change. Is it inevitable that we're not going to get there? From what I'm hearing today, it's not inevitable to read climate change, that you've already achieved some major things. And certainly the situation is dire, but I'd like you to comment on this idea of change, and do we need more change makers to come into the arena? I'm thinking of Greta, who's obviously made a dent, I think, from an age demographic view. And I'd like to call her a change maker, but has it become already like, oh yeah, that's Greta speaking her thing, and you know, very, very, very good. We had a panelist today who talked about her work protesting and so on, and often she'll hear from the people she's protesting against, the officials, let's say, or the government even, you know, fantastic work, we're really proud of you, the fact that you're doing this today. But she's saying, you know, but I'm not making a dent then in your thinking. And it's one thing to pat me on the back, but that's not what I'm here for. So I just wonder, yeah, can we unpack this idea of change making, and do we need other people, and who do we need, or is it really going to be a collective uprising? I mean, it's not an easy question for you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe we'll start with Stefaan, since Sarah went just previously.
Thanks, Keith. Easy question. Yeah. So, well, I mean, one way to think about it, especially in the context of climate, right, which is the topic of today's session here, and of course of Earth Day as well, is that one way to think about it is that we clearly need new solutions, right, to tackle with the challenges that can instigate change. But from my point of view, we not only need new solutions, we actually need to change the way we develop solutions as well. And I think from my point of view, that's actually part of the problem in order to facilitate change, is that we automatically jump to the solution space, but not to how do we actually develop solutions, and how do we change that process for developing solutions as well. So that's one way to answer. The question then is, of course, what needs to change with regard to how we go about solutions? And then, of course, in the context of today's conference, how does data play a role, or how do we need to change the way we actually use data as a way to change the way we go about solutions? And the first shift from my point of view that we really need to pay more or take more seriously is the shift from really immediately starting with thinking about the solutions to paying more attention to the problem. I think we jump too fast into actually the solution space quite often. And as already Sarah was referring to, this is an interdependent environment. And many of the solutions actually create new problems if we don't think about what is the problem and what are the interdependencies that actually we need to be aware of. And as it relates to data, that means that we need not just to spend more time on what's the data, but we need to spend more time on what are the questions that matter, right? And what are the questions that are actually important to answer? Because too often in the data space, we start from the supply of data without thinking about what is actually the question for which we then need data for, that then will inform us better about the problem that we seek to solve. And so that would be my first kind of cluster of change that we need to instigate, is that let's actually, and as you know, Keith, I've been advocating for that, let's invest in question science in addition to data science, right? Because we need to actually have a new way as a society, a new way to formulate questions that is both participatory, but also really enshrined in the problems that we want to prioritize, not just the questions that are, anyway, we can answer because we happen to have the data, right? So that's the first part. The second part is that we also need to change in who we engage, right? Because typically we engage, anyway, a lot of the discussions about environmental aspects are quite often based upon disciplinary kind of sectors. And from my point of view, once we understand the question and the problem, we will realize that actually we need many more non-traditional actors, part of thinking about the solution, right? And so, like, to just give you an example, we did a lot of work around, for instance, certain kinds of diseases that are actually environmental increase, such as diseases that are anyway generated. Anyway, I'm not going to go too deep into the scientific aspect here. Generated by, for instance, mosquitoes, right? And so if you really start understanding the problem of mosquitoes, for instance, that part of the problem is that where do they breed? Well, they breed in standing water. Who are the specialists in standing water? They are not the public health officials. They are quite often those that are building pools. And we would never, right, think about bringing those people that are building pools to the table for coming up with solutions that are typically labeled as either a climate or a public health kind of problem. So we need to be broader and thinking about the supply of expertise in society that quite often is non-traditional. And so we need to change the way we go about engaging them. We also need to change in, anyway, the way we make decisions as it relates to prioritization, right? As I mentioned, it's very important to focus on questions, but we also have to focus on question equity, by which I mean is that who actually gets to formulate the questions for which we then subsequently find answers. And again, there's a lot of discussion about data equity. Let's also focus on question equity, because that will change the type of questions we seek to answer, and it will change the way we go about solutions. And then last point, because I'm eager to hear what Sarah has to say about the change question here. But last point, we really also have to change with our quite often main focus on generating insight, and then not thinking about how do we translate data intelligence or insight into actually decisions. I mean, too often in the data space, we declare victory once we have generated some insight, right, from the data that has been generated. But then, right, quite often the last mile, or the most important mile, i.e. how do we actually translate insight into action, gets largely ignored. And we need to do a lot more work on the environment in which decisions are made. I've been advocating that we need to build new kinds of decision theaters for the kind of problems that we have, that is informed by data, but also that has a particular kind of dynamic on how you actually go about making decisions as well. And so change in the way we go about formulating questions and defining the problem, change in who we actually engage with regard to developing solution, change in who is actually part of the formulation of questions, and also change in the way we get to focus on insight and how it gets translated into decision making. And I think those are the changes that probably will actually produce better solutions by focusing on how we come up with solutions as well. So just a few remarks here, Keith.
Just a few. Awesome.
Just a few.
All valuable though. So Sarah, what say you on this?
I was just agreeing. I was agreeing heartily with so much of what you were saying, Stefan. So that I think that's so serendipitous and excellent that we have ended up on a panel together. So taking my IPCC hat off, I do a lot of work on participatory processes and sustainability transformations in small businesses and municipalities all over the place. And I would have a couple of reflections on change that I think align with what you just heard. So one is that change is certainly already happening. Transformation is already underway in so many facets of our life, but whether or not those are desirable transformations or ones that we collectively, in fact, want to pursue, of course, is an open question, and many of them are clearly undesirable. One of the things that I think we've been missing is creative processes, creative and inclusive processes for envisioning the future that we want, not just what we are trying to move away from, not all of the things we're trying to abandon or stop or finish, but what we're actually pushing towards. what mobilizes us and activates us and inspires us, and where do we have shared values? And there are so many cool tools emerging, for how to do that. And we've worked in participatory scenario development and visualization so that you can actually see your neighborhood in the future, viscerally feel the emotions of living in a different space instead of just analytically process data in sort of traditional data presentation formats like graphs and charts. And I realize that this community would be much more sophisticated than that, but most scientists actually are not. And so using art, using stories, using games to integrate values with science so that we can envision that future that we're pushing towards is such a crucial element. And as part of that process, everything that Stefan was saying is so important, because who's around the table matters. What, that will influence what comes out the other side. And there's an incredible amount of power in being able to set the agenda or shape the questions, right? That's, power isn't just being able to force someone to do what they wouldn't have normally done. Power is also the ability to ask questions and shape the way those questions are asked and answered. And a quick example that I would give of this is that I've been part of a federal government process since last August to develop our first national climate change adaptation plan. So how do we protect communities from climate change? We don't have an adaptation plan yet in Canada, so we've been working on that. And so you'll have people like me coming up against people who work on emergencies and public safety and preparedness. And they would say, we need to protect community bodies and people's bodies and people's homes by these emergency measures. So the problem is that these houses are built in places that are exposed to climate change, and that's how I frame the problem. Another person would come in and say, what if the problem is poverty? Like, that's a very different question and problem and set of solutions to this problem if you have those different voices around the table. So I would just say an inclusive, creative, imaginative processes for thinking about the future that we are collectively trying to reach is such an important part of transformative change.
I like both your answers there. I think, yeah, well done. We're actually out of time, so we've made it through our 45 minutes, and obviously we could talk some more about this. And I think, a couple of things, we Changemakers and so on. I mean, enthusiasm, passion, and we saw so many people today with that passion as you've exhibited. So as I would say to anyone in your work, carry on. It's really wonderful. So much appreciated that you joined us today. And I'm sure, we'll continue this conversation in one venue or another, and perhaps in person next time. So once again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome.